are stronger, you are stronger. Sin is broken, you have saved me. It is written, Christ is risen. Jesus, you are Lord of all. No beginning and no end. You're my hope and my defense. You came to seek and save the lost. You paid it all upon the cross.
The last name explicitly mentioned in Hebrews 11 is Samuel, whose powerful story is narrated in the book named for him. Nathan Guy is an adjunct professor of theology at Heritage Christian University, and he's the president of Mars Hill Bible School in Florence, Alabama. In this lesson, he shows us how Samuel demonstrates faithfulness and ultimately points us toward Jesus.
And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. C.S. Lewis was once asked what he thought about gambling, and he said, "Not very much. I don't know much about it, and I'm horrible at it." And he said, if anybody ever asks to gamble with him, he would say, "Tell me how much money you expect to win. Here, take it and leave me alone." This is how I feel when I'm asked to discuss a passage that seems to say, how can God grow in favor with God? I want to say, imagine whatever it is you want me to say, assume I said it, and go away. This is a very difficult passage. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. I suppose a careful study of that verse would probably reveal that Luke had in mind the fulfillment of prophecy and the uniqueness of Christ. And I suppose that there's much here that in the passage that draws us to a vision like no other. The perfect man who grows from grace to grace on a road in which he was destined. God growing in favor with God is a powerful and awesome thought. And I hope you'll forgive me if I just skip that hard question. But we can look into the eyes of the Lord. We can follow His steps. We can answer His call. The question that I want you to think about is, can we be like Him in any way? In any way, is that remotely possible? So that we too could grow in favor with God. Can I learn something about my own feeble walk with God by turning my attention to the boy in the temple? I believe the answer is yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He is so infinitely more than my example, but He's also that. And in this moment of worship, in the presence of the Holy One, we ask, oh God, can we be like Christ and grow in favor with You? And if so, speak, Lord, for Your servant is listening. So I open my Bible and I read these words. He grew in favor with God. Just one chapter earlier, we hear the beautiful prayer of his mother as she cries out, "My soul magnifies the Lord," and then dedicates her son to God. The reader knows that the man of the house is not really his father. He plays a father figure role. The boy is a man of God, and he shows himself to be so, even at a very young age. There he is. Picture him in the house of the Lord, training himself in the law. We hear in a story from his youth that he learns to bypass all the other voices, even the voice of his father figure, to recognize the one who has called him to this task. And how does the Bible describe this young hero of ours? Surrounded by priests, given the official role of teaching the law, our hero stands head and shoulders above those men, recognizing whose house this is and just what calling he possesses. He grew in stature and in favor with God and man. You know, stories about Jesus are riveting and exciting. They remind us of his uniqueness. But you still say, how in the world am I supposed to apply that to me? Well, good thing I really wasn't talking about Jesus. The story I just read for you and the quotes I just gave you are not in the Gospel of Luke. This is a story about Samuel, the boy priest, in the first book that bears his name. And yet it's not a coincidence that when Luke opens his magnificent gospel, he tells a story that sounds so eerily familiar. The last man to serve as both prophet and priest over God's people is long gone and sorely missed. And yet in this boy, Jesus, prophet, priest, and king combine. Now, how did Samuel grow in favor with God? If you read 1 Samuel 2 very carefully, you'll find two verses that serve as sort of bookends to the story. The first one is in verse 21. It says, "The boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord." And verse 26 is the memorable one. "He grew in stature and in favor with God and man." It just so happens that Luke 2 also gives us two bookends. Before the temple scene, in verse 40, the text tells us the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. And then in verse 52, he grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So if those are the bookends, what's in between? We all know that Luke's story in between is the boy Jesus in the temple. But the Samuel story is very telling. Between the bookends that parallel Luke's narrative is a report. It seems that Eli's real sons are not acting like their father. They don't respect their father, and the text sadly says they would not listen to the voice of their father. But Samuel did. He acted more like a son to Eli, God's representative on earth, than Eli's own children did. And in that way, Samuel grew in favor with God. Now, you've got to remember that this all takes place at the tabernacle in Shiloh, the tent of meeting, the house where one goes to meet God. Then we turn from Samuel 1 to Luke 2. What makes the story about Jesus so remarkable is that here he is, in the house where one goes to meet God. And he's determined to learn the law, to ask questions, and to demonstrate his obedience to God. And one more thing. To his father figure, he says, "Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house, about my Father's business, involved in my Father's work?" We've got to stop telling ourselves, "I can never live like Jesus." The gospel writers tell us that Jesus came in the spirit of those who had gone before, getting it better, getting it right. But Jesus serves as our example precisely because he answers the same call that was given to us long ago. The call to David to be God's man even in the face of betrayal. The call to John, the baptizer, to be God's servant even in the face of mortal danger. The call to Moses to be God's instrument, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. He lived like us so that we might live like him. How did Jesus grow in favor with God? Two ways. First, he claimed God as his Father. Even more accurately, he acknowledged God's claim on him to be God's Son. Just read Proverbs 3 and verse 4, a proverb addressed from a father to my child. Do you want to find favor and good repute in the sight of God and all the people? Then look at verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make straight your paths. He was at peace with God's voice as the only voice to hear, God's will as the only will to seek. Can you imagine being so in tune with the Father? C.S. Lewis claimed that the highest prayers are those that ask for nothing. To be in the state which you are so at one with the will of God that you wouldn't want to alter the course of events, even if you could. The highest form of prayer. Second, Jesus did the seeking. He did his Father's bidding. He studied, he served, he labored and loved. He welcomed truth and avoided evil. He ministered faithfully and he ran from temptation. He did what he was told. This is how you can identify the true son. Just as the true neighbor is the one who acts neighborly, the Son of God obeys dutifully the voice of his Father, and Jesus grew in favor with God. So what does the boy Samuel have to do with the boy Jesus? For the Bible authors, both Old and New Testaments, the heroes of faith progressed in favor with God the way we're all called to progress in favor with God. By living virtuously, choosing wisely, acting without self-interest, in obedience to our Father, who he acknowledged as the one and only one who controls our lives. Jesus also acted in self-sacrificial, God-focused obedience. He did what he was told for the good of others, even when it got hard. He progressed in virtue in an upward journey toward perfection. We know this because the word favor here carries the idea of reciprocity and social obligation. In Luke's larger storyline, the idea of patronage is very prominent. A person wins over or curries favor from his boss, his leader, or his father. And in return, the one in charge offers grace, benevolence, and goodwill. We see it all through Luke's writings. Is it hard for you to think of Jesus earning God's respect? Well, according to Luke, Jesus' mother Mary faces her unexpected pregnancy with a self-sacrificial resolve. Denying her own self-interest, she accepts the angelic message. And in return, Luke says, Mary is called the highly favored one. Luke 1, verse 30. Luke says that the apostles gathered in Jerusalem in Acts 2, and they experienced the favor of God and all the people because they sold everything they had and they gave it to the needy, and there was no poor among them. In each case, the hero mentioned acted according to God's will, even when it might have gone against personal interest. For Luke, the lowly servant wins respect by choosing virtue, taking the high road, serving the needs of others, growing in knowledge and spiritual fruit. And in fact, to really push the point, diligent study and decisive action are involved. Luke even uses this word favor in places where the best translation is probably gaining credit from God and from other people. Just think of Jesus' message in his Sermon on the Plain. If you only love those who love you, do good to those who do good to you, or lend to those who lend to you, what credit is that to you? Instead, act virtuously, do the right thing, self-sacrificially, and your reward shall be great. So for Luke, Jesus progressed in favor with God the way we're all called to progress in favor with God, by living virtuously, choosing wisely, acting without self-interest, in obedience to our Father, whom he acknowledged as the one and only one who controls our lives. And the writer of Hebrews confirms this point. Although he was a son, says the author, he learned obedience through the things he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Maybe you have a hard time with this idea, winning God's respect through doing what's right. Maybe you had a very difficult father whose expectations for you could never be matched, and that gnaws at you whenever you hear language like this. Or maybe you think of those wonderful moments in your youth when you just messed up and your dad or your youth minister said to you those stirring words that brought comfort. What you've done does not change God's love for you. He loved you when you had nothing to offer him. What makes you think that now in your difficult moment he could love you any less? Is that true? Of course that's true. 1,000 times that's true. So how do we square that truth with this truth? Well, it helps us to remember verse 40, which comes before the temple scene. Before we're told of the boy Jesus living dutifully in the presence of God, we're told that the boy Jesus grew and became strong, and the favor of God was upon him. And that's not just true with Jesus. That was true with Samuel, and it's true with you. The boy Samuel, before we see his deeds in comparison with Eli's wicked sons, is introduced to us with these words. The boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. God's love for you, his calling on you, his acceptance of you is by his grace. He adopted you as his child before you had anything to offer him. And the Samuel story, between the bookends, gives us rich insight here. Eli, brooding over his sons, cries out, if one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Enter Jesus at God's initiative to intercede for us, which we neither earned nor deserve. But unlike getting taller or older, growing in wisdom involves decision and action. And growing in favor with God includes our decision to become what God has called us to be. We're right to sing, just as I am. Our Father takes us just as we are. But his desire, his calling, is to develop virtues of character through sustained, disciplined, self-sacrificial obedience. And that can make a difference, whether when we're dead and gone, others tell our story as the wicked sons in the doorway rejecting our Father, or those who acknowledge our calling, trust in the one who calls us, and respond faithfully. May it be said that you were one who not only stood, but grew in favor with God.
No beginning and no end. You're my hope and my defense. You came to seek and save the lost. You paid it all upon the cross. You are stronger. You are stronger. Sin is broken.